Picture this. You wake up and hear the headline. America just used nuclear weapons again. Not in 1945. In Korea. Against targets tied to China. And you're sitting there thinking, if that line just got crossed again, what happens next? What happens to me? You and I grew up with an assumption. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons became a locked door, something the world feared, but didn't touch. You hear the word nuclear and you think unthinkable. But in the early 1950s, the world stood much closer to that door opening again than most people realize. To understand why, you have to drop into the mindset of that moment. The world was still shaking out of World War II. Korea had been split in two, north and south, along a line that turned into a real border, with real soldiers facing each other every day. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The United States and other countries, under the United Nations banner, rushed in. The front line swung hard. First, a desperate retreat, then a breakout, then a drive north. And then came the moment that changed the entire shape of the war. China intervened. Huge numbers of Chinese troops entered the fight, and suddenly this didn't feel like a regional conflict anymore. It felt like a superpower test, one that could pull your country, your family, and your future into something far bigger than the Korean peninsula. This is where one man steps into the frame. General Douglas MacArthur. You may know the image. Decorated, famous, absolutely confident. But in this story, what matters is his argument. MacArthur believed the only way to stop China's momentum was to hit the supply system feeding those forces. Not just inside Korea, across the border in Manchuria, and he didn't want to rely on conventional strikes alone. He pushed for nuclear weapons as battlefield tools, aimed at key rail hubs, bridges, and staging areas. Now, meet the person who said no in our real history, President Harry Truman. Truman feared escalation. He feared a wider war. He feared setting a precedent the world could never walk back. And when MacArthur wouldn't back down, Truman removed him. One of the most dramatic civil-military clashes in U.S. history. But now, you and I step onto the alternate track. Because in this timeline, Truman doesn't remove him. The debate ends differently. The call goes through, the authorization comes back, the order gets typed. And the most powerful weapon ever built stops being a warning in the background and becomes an active plan. You can almost feel the moment it turns. Washington says yes. You feel the decision turn into motion almost overnight. The language stays calm. Targets, timing, weather windows. But the tool has changed, and you can sense everyone in the chain forcing themselves to treat it like routine. You and I can picture the map on the wall. Korea on one side, the border river, and then Manchuria beyond it. The goal isn't to conquer China. The goal is to cut the lifeline feeding Chinese forces in Korea. Stop the trains, the trucks, the stockpiles, and you isolate the troops already fighting. That's the logic driving everything. You hear crews briefed in plain terms. You hear about B-29 bombers, the same type used late in World War II, being prepared again. Planners choose airbursts set to detonate above the ground because they believe that increases the effect against rail yards, bridges, and staging areas. And you can feel the uncomfortable shift. Air power that was supposed to support troops on the front line is now aimed at fixed points on the far side of a border. The targets are described as infrastructure: rail hubs, supply depots, road junctions, river crossings, the places that keep an army moving. What shocks you isn't one single moment. It's the pace. This doesn't happen as one dramatic strike followed by a pause. It turns into a schedule. One mission leads to the next, and then the next. You hear the same phrase again and again: deny support, deny movement, deny resupply. The idea is to create a level of disruption that conventional air attacks can't sustain for long. In this timeline, leaders convince themselves atomic weapons can do it faster, with fewer sorties, and with less risk to pilots. You also notice what's missing from the public language. Leaders don't frame this as an attack on cities. They frame it as a way to end a war. They argue it will shorten the fighting and reduce overall losses. And the argument has a brutal logic you can understand. When supply lines break, units run out of food, fuel, and ammunition. When that happens, units stop advancing. They pull back, or they begin to unravel. The plan is built around making the Chinese force in Korea feel that squeeze all at once. Inside the command structure, you can feel the tension between speed and control. Once the first weapons are used, the pressure to keep using them grows. Commanders argue that stopping halfway makes no sense. If the goal is isolation, they need repeated strikes on key routes, repair points, and choke paths. So the operation continues, and it starts to feel less like a last resort, and more like a tool that's now sitting on the table. Then you see the first reports that it's working. Rail traffic slows, bridges are down, supply dumps are disrupted. Chinese units at the front start pulling back from exposed positions. The line shifts. To people watching from far away, it starts to look like the problem has been solved. But you can feel the larger question rising underneath everything. If this worked once, what does it do to every future crisis when leaders feel cornered? You feel the front line change in a way that seems impossible at first. For months, you've watched the Korean conflict swing back and forth, every advance answered by a hard push in the other direction. Now, in this timeline, the pressure on Chinese forces in Korea builds fast. Supplies arrive late, or don't arrive at all. Vehicles sit idle because fuel never shows up. Units that once moved in large formations start moving in smaller groups, then stop moving entirely. You and I don't need military training to understand what that means. An army that can't resupply can't keep attacking. American and Allied commanders see the shift and press forward. Ground forces push north with more confidence because the opposing side has less ability to reinforce. Air and artillery support becomes more effective. Not because the weapons changed, but because the enemy's ability to respond has weakened. The pace of the campaign accelerates. Town after town changes hands. And then the thing people argued about from the beginning starts to feel real. A unified Korea under a non-communist government stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like the likely outcome. You hear reports of large Chinese formations trying to pull back toward the border, but the routes are disrupted and the timing is wrong. When the flow of supplies breaks, coordination breaks with it. Units get separated, communications fail, orders arrive late. Troops are left choosing between retreating without equipment or staying in place without support. Over time, the Chinese presence shrinks, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a long, grinding loss of momentum that ends with retreat and surrender in pockets. The fighting doesn't vanish overnight, but the direction becomes undeniable. In Washington, leaders begin to speak as if the decision worked. They describe it as a hard choice that prevented an even harder outcome. They point to a goal that now looks within reach, ending the conflict on terms favorable to the United States and its allies. In Seoul, you can imagine the mix of relief and exhaustion as the idea of a single government for the whole peninsula comes back into view. In this timeline, negotiations come from strength, not desperation. The shooting mostly stops. A new political order takes shape. Korea reunifies under a government aligned with the West. And for a moment, you might think the story ends right there. You might think, that's it, it's over. We won. You might even feel the temptation to file it away as a brutal but effective choice from a different era. But this is where I slow down. Because this is where the real trap snaps shut. Because you and I aren't only watching Korea, we're watching a rule change in real time. The United States has used atomic weapons in a limited conflict, not as the final act of a world war, but as a tool to force an outcome. And that single fact becomes a message every capital can read, even if nobody says it out loud. If a superpower feels blocked, it may reach for the biggest lever it has. So the camera in your mind pulls up from the peninsula. It rises past border rivers and mountain passes. It moves beyond Tokyo, Manila, and Honolulu. It crosses the Pacific and lands on the question that now follows the United States everywhere. If it happened here, where else could it happen? And the people most focused on that question aren't in Korea at all. They're watching from Moscow. You and I and Part 3 staring at a map that suddenly feels too small. Korea is unified in this timeline, and leaders in Washington can point to a clear outcome. But the world doesn't forget how that outcome was reached. The moment the United States uses atomic weapons in a limited conflict, every major power updates its assumptions. Not because they hate America, and not because they misunderstand America, but because they now have proof that under pressure, the strongest country on Earth will use its biggest tool to force an answer. From here, the future splits into two paths, and both of them change what life feels like for you. In the first path, the reaction is immediate. Moscow doesn't treat this as a regional event. It treats it as a test of boundaries. If the United States can strike across a border to cut off a partner tied to Soviet interests, Soviet leaders have to decide quickly whether to respond in kind, respond through pressure, or step back and accept a new imbalance. Decisions like that compress time. They make every misunderstanding sharper. They turn diplomacy into a high-stress contest where nobody wants to look weak. And in a world like that, a crisis in Berlin, a standoff at sea, or a mistake in the air can spiral faster than anyone intends. Even if leaders want to avoid a wider clash, the pressure to match and signal can push them into choices that are hard to reverse. In the second path, nothing explodes right away. That sounds comforting. It even looks stable on paper. Trade continues, alliances hold, speeches talk about peace. But something deep has still shifted. The biggest shift is psychological. Atomic weapons stop being a never-again symbol and become a sometimes tool. And you can feel how that would leak into every future standoff. If leaders believe atomic weapons can end a conflict quickly, they may start planning around that option from the beginning. And if one country plans that way, others will plan to answer it. That means faster buildups, more weapons kept on alert, and more moments where everyone is waiting for the other side to blink. You might tell yourself, that's all far away. But in this timeline, it reaches into your everyday life. It shapes defense budgets. It shapes where bases are built. It shapes how often reservists train. It shapes the constant low hum of anxiety that sits under the surface during every international crisis. Even if you never hear the classified details, you feel the atmosphere change. The world becomes more tense, more rigid, and less forgiving of mistakes. And then there's MacArthur. In this story, I'm not turning him into a cartoon. You and I can understand how a commander, responsible for soldiers on the line, could believe a decisive tool would save lives and end suffering faster. He's confident, experienced, and used to bold moves. But you can also see the blind spot. He's focused on winning the immediate fight. He doesn't fully weigh what happens after the precedent is set, when every future leader is tempted to copy the play. So, I end with the question that matters to you, not to a history book. If your country wins the battle but changes the rules of the world, is that still a win? And if you lived in the decades that followed, would you feel safer, or would it feel like the ground under you never stopped shaking?